The sound came first, as it always did, a wet slap of flippers against concrete, a burst of children's laughter ricocheting off curved walls, and beneath it all, the low mechanical hum of filtration systems working endlessly to maintain the illusion of ocean. But there was something else that morning, something that made the trainers pause mid-routine and the early visitors lean forward in their seats without understanding why. The whale had moved to a position she rarely occupied, pressing herself against the easternmost panel of glass where the viewing corridor connected to exhibits, and she was not alone.
A seal smaller, older,
scarred along one side from an incident no one at the park discussed anymore, had settled on the narrow ledge just beyond the glass, close enough that their bodies seemed to share the same boundary of light and shadow. They were watching each other with an intensity that felt almost intrusive to witness, as though the humans gathered around them had accidentally stumbled into a conversation that had been happening for years. The whale's eye, ancient and unfathomable, held something that would haunt the visitors who saw it that day, something that would return to them in quiet moments for decades afterward. If you leave now, you will never understand what passed between them. Never learn why this moment mattered more than all the performances this park had ever staged. So stay until the water stills and the silence speaks. The seal did not move.
The whale did not blink.
And somewhere in the crowd, a child stopped asking questions and simply watched. The mornings at the park began long before the gates opened to the public, long before the first school buses pulled into the parking lot with their cargo of restless children and exhausted teachers. In the earliest hours, when the sky was still transitioning from black to gray, the sounds were different, mechanical rather than human, functional rather than festive. Pumps cycled through their rhythms. Filters processed thousands of gallons of water. Generators hummed in basements that visitors would never see. The animals stirred in their enclosures, their internal clocks aligned not with sunrise but with feeding schedules that had been refined over decades of institutional practice. The whale moved through her tank in patterns that had become as natural as breathing, circuits that took her past the same windows, the same walls, the same carefully designed features, meant to simulate an environment she had not experienced since infancy. She knew every inch of this space. She knew where the water was warmest, where the currents were strongest, where the light fell at different hours of the day. She knew these things the way she knew her own body, completely, instinctively, without the need for conscious thought. The seal had arrived at the park years after she did, transferred from another facility under circumstances that were explained in paperwork, but never discussed openly. He was older than most of the pinnipeds in the collection, his body marked by experiences that predated his captivity. A long scar along his left flank that trainers attributed to a boat propeller. A missing section of one rear flipper that affected his swimming, but not his spirit. He had been placed in the exhibit adjacent to her tank, separated by walls and glass and the careful planning of architects who had never considered that animals might form connections across these barriers. But the whale had noticed him from the first day of his arrival. She had felt the vibrations of his movements through the shared infrastructure of the building. She had heard his vocalizations as so different from her own, so much higher in frequency, filtering through the water and the walls. And she had begun, gradually, to spend more time near the eastern panel of glass where the two exhibits came closest to touching. The connection between them was not something the staff immediately recognized. They were focused on their routines, their schedules, the endless logistics of maintaining a facility that housed dozens of species and entertained thousands of visitors each week. They documented feeding patterns and health metrics and behavioral observations, but they did not document the way the whale positioned herself each morning near the glass,
or the way the seal would haul himself onto the ledge closest to her position and remain there for hours,
his dark eyes fixed on her massive form. These behaviors were noted only in passing, dismissed as curiosities rather than patterns, filed away in the vast archive of unremarkable observations that accumulated over years of operation. It would take much longer for anyone to understand what was happening, to recognize that something genuine was developing between two creatures that the taxonomic charts insisted had nothing in common. The first school groups of the day arrived with their usual chaos, spilling from buses in waves of color-coded t-shirts and mismatched energy levels. Teachers called out instructions that dissolved in the morning air.
Chaperones counted heads and distributed tickets and worried about bathrooms and lunch schedules and all.
The small concerns that accompanied the transportation of children from one location to another. The children themselves moved with the particular intensity of young humans in novel environments, starting ahead, falling behind, clustering around anything that caught their collective attention. They had been promised whales and dolphins and seals and sharks, and they intended to see all of these things before the day was over. Their excitement registered in the ambient sound of the park, a rising frequency of chatter and footsteps, and occasional shrieks that announced their approach. Long before they became visible, the whale heard them coming. She always heard them coming. The sound of school groups had a particular texture that she had learned to recognize over decades of exposure to the higher pitch of children's voices, the periodic interruptions of adult authority, the background percussion of small feet on concrete pathways. She knew what would come next. She knew the groups would flow through the viewing areas in waves, pressing faces against glass, tapping surfaces despite the signs that asked them not to, calling out to her as though she might respond to their particular combination of sounds. She had performed for thousands of these groups. She had breached and waved and accepted fish in front of their watching eyes. She understood her role in this exchange, even if she could not articulate what that role meant in terms the humans would recognize. But this morning, she did not move to her usual position. She remained near the eastern glass, near the seal who had become her silent companion, and she watched the corridor fill with small bodies and large expectations.
The children noticed her immediately. How could they not notice a creature of her size pressed against the glass at eye level?
They clustered around the window, their faces appearing in the blue-lit space like a collection of moons, each one distinct but somehow interchangeable. They pointed and whispered and shouted for friends to come see.
And then, gradually, they noticed the seal as well.
They saw how close he was to the glass on his side. They saw how the two animals seemed to be oriented toward each other, their attention focused not on the human audience, but on each other. Questions began to form on young lips. Why is she so close to him? Can they see each other? Are they friends? The teachers, having no answers to offer, redirected attention toward the scheduled programming, herding their charges toward the main stadium where the shows would soon begin. The seal had learned to anticipate her presence, the way creatures learn to anticipate anything that brings comfort in an environment that offers little control. He would emerge from the water each morning and make his way to the ledge closest to her tank, moving with the awkward determination that characterized his species on land. The other seals in his exhibit paid little attention to this behavior. They had their own routines, their own preferred resting spots,
Their own concerns that did not extend beyond the boundaries of their shared space.
but he was drawn to the glass with a consistency that suggested something more than habit. He would settle on the ledge and turn his body toward her tank, his eyes finding her shape through the layers of glass and water that separated them. He would remain there for hours, rarely moving, watching her with an attention that seemed almost meditative in its stillness. The whale, for her part, had never experienced anything quite like this connection. In the ocean and the fragmented memories she carried of open water and infinite horizons, there had been others of her kind, presences whose calls could be felt across miles of sea. But here, in the confines of her tank, she had lived in a particular kind of solitude that was not quite loneliness, but was not quite anything else either. The humans came and went. The trainers interacted with her according to schedules and protocols. Other whales had shared her space at various times, some surviving for years, others departing in ways that were never explained, but always felt as absences in the water. But none of these relationships had felt like what she felt now. Watching this scarred and aging seal watch her through the glass each morning, It was not love in any sense that humans would recognize. It was something simpler and perhaps more profound: recognition, acknowledgement,
The comfort of being seen by another creature who expected nothing in return.
The shows proceeded on schedule, as they always did, regardless of what was happening in the quiet corners of the park where no audiences gathered. The whale performed her routines with the precision that decades of training had instilled, hitting her marks, executing her behaviors, accepting her rewards. The crowds applauded and photographed and departed satisfied, carrying their memories away with them into lives she would never see. Between shows, she returned to her position near the eastern glass, and the seal was always there, waiting with the patience of a creature who had nowhere else to be. They would remain like that, she floating, he resting, while the sounds of the park cycled through their familiar patterns around them. Visitors passed through the corridor that connected their exhibits,
Some noticing the unusual tableau, most hurrying toward attractions that promised more obvious entertainment.
An elderly woman became the first to truly see what was happening between them. She had come to the park alone, a widow whose husband had died the previous winter, and who was attempting to fill her days with activities that would keep her from sitting in an empty house. She had no particular interest in marine mammals. She had chosen the park simply because it was somewhere to go, somewhere that was not the rooms she and her husband had shared for 43 years. She wandered through the exhibits without expectation, glancing at tanks and enclosures with the detached attention of someone who was not really present in her own experience. But when she reached the corridor between the whale exhibit and the seal exhibit, when she saw the two animals positioned on either side of the glass, something in her stopped. She found a bench nearby and sat down. She watched them watching each other, and she felt, for the first time since her husband's death, something other than the flat gray numbness that had colonized her interior landscape.
She returned the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that.
She came early, before the crowds, and she stayed late, after the families with young children had departed. She brought a thermos of tea and a book she never read, props that justified her presence on the bench she had claimed as her own.
The staff began to recognize her. This quiet woman who sat for hours watching two animals watch each other.
They assumed she was simply lonely, simply filling time, simply doing what old people sometimes did when they had nowhere else to be. They did not understand that she was witnessing something that reminded her of her own. Marriage, not the passionate early years, not the busy middle years, but the final years, when she and her husband would sit together in comfortable silence, no longer needing words to communicate, simply present with each other in a way that transcended language. The seasons turned in the way seasons turn when you are not paying attention to them. The park decorated for holidays and then removed the decorations. School groups gave way to summer tourists, who gave way to autumn school groups again. The whale measured time not by these human cycles, but by subtler changes. Angle of light through the windows above her tank. The temperature fluctuations that occurred despite the climate control systems. The gradual aging she could feel in her own body as years accumulated like sediment. The seal aged too, his movements growing slower, his time in the water decreasing as hauling himself onto land became more difficult. But he still made his way to the ledge each morning. He still positioned himself where she could see him. He still watched her with eyes that held something she recognized as devotion, though she would not have used that word to describe it.
The elderly woman died on a Tuesday in early spring in a hospital room not far from the park.
Her children, who lived in other cities and visited rarely, cleared out her apartment and found it remarkably empty. She had given away most of her possessions in her final months, keeping only the essentials and a small collection of photographs that included,
Inexplicably, several images of a whale and a seal on either side of a glass wall.
They did not understand the significance of these photographs. They assumed their mother had developed some late-life eccentricity,
some attachment to animals she had never shown during the decades of her active life. They kept one photograph out of a vague sense of obligation and discarded the rest. never knowing that those images represented the closest thing to peace their mother had found. In the dark months after their father's death, the staff noticed when the woman stopped coming, in the way staff noticed the absence of any regular presence. They speculated briefly about what might have happened to her moved to a nursing home, perhaps, or traveled to visit family and then they returned to their duties, their concerns displaced by the endless demands of operating a facility that served thousands of visitors each week.
The whale noticed too, in her own way.
She had grown accustomed to the woman's presence on the bench, the quiet figure who watched without expectation or demand. The absence registered as a subtle change in the patterns she had memorized, a gap in the familiar arrangement of her daily experience. She continued to return to the eastern glass. She continued to watch the seal who continued to watch her. But something was different now. Something she could not articulate and would not have known how to express, even if she had the capacity for human language. The child who asked the question that no one could answer arrived on a Saturday afternoon in late summer, when the park was crowded with families taking advantage of the final weeks before school resumed. She was perhaps 6 years old, small for her age, with the kind of quiet intensity that marked children who observed more than they participated. She had been brought to the park by her grandmother, a woman who remembered visiting this same facility decades earlier and wanted to share the experience with a new generation. They had watched the main show together, applauded together, purchased an overpriced lunch together, and now they were wandering through the exhibits, the grandmother's energy flagging while the child's curiosity remained inexhaustible.
They reached the corridor between the whale and seal exhibits just as the afternoon light was hitting the glass at its most flattering angle. The child stopped walking.
She looked at the whale pressed against the glass. She looked at the seal on his ledge. She watched them watching each other.
And then she asked, in the clear voice of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, "Are they sad because they can't touch?"
The grandmother, caught off guard, offered the kind of vague reassurance that adults provide when they have no real answer. The animals were well cared for. They had everything they needed. They were happy here. But the child was not satisfied. She continued watching, her small face serious with the effort of comprehension. She could see what the adults around her could not see, or would not see, or had trained themselves not to see. She could see that something was happening between these two creatures that had nothing to do with training or entertainment or the carefully constructed narrative the park presented to its visitors. Years passed with the indifference that years have toward the creatures who must live through them. The whale grew older, her movements slowing almost imperceptibly at first, and then with increasing obviousness. The shows were modified to accommodate her reduced capabilities. New whales were brought in, younger animals who would eventually take her place in the routines that audiences expected. She was not retired exactly. The word retirement implied a decisive transition that did not match the gradual nature of her decline. She simply participated less, rested more, spent increasing amounts of time in the quieter corners of her tank, where the water was still and the demands were few. But she never stopped returning to the eastern glass. She never stopped positioning herself where she could see the seal who, despite his own advancing age, continued to make his way to the ledge each morning with the determination of someone keeping a promise. The seal's decline was more visible than the whale's, his body betraying its deterioration in ways that could not be hidden from observers. He moved more slowly now. He spent more time in the water, where buoyancy made movement easier.
The ledge that had been his morning destination for years became difficult to reach,
requiring multiple attempts and rest breaks that had not been necessary before. The veterinary staff increased their monitoring, documenting the progression of conditions that were inevitable but nonetheless concerning. There were discussions about quality of life, about intervention, about the difficult decisions that had to be made when animals in captivity reached certain stages of decline. But for now, he continued, for now, he hauled himself onto the ledge each morning and turned his face toward the glass where she waited. The morning he did not appear,
She knew something was wrong before any human could have told her.
She had been waiting at the glass since before dawn, watching the empty ledge on the other side, waiting for the familiar shape to emerge from the water and position itself where she could see it. The minutes passed.
The park opened.
The first visitors of the day began filtering through the corridors, and still the ledge remained empty. She pressed herself closer to the glass,
as though proximity might somehow bridge the distance that separated their worlds. She made sounds low, rumbling vocalizations that traveled through the water and the walls. Sounds that had no meaning in human language, but that expressed something nonetheless.
The trainers noticed her agitation, documented it, added it to the accumulating observations that would later be reviewed in meetings about her welfare.
The sealer died during the night, quietly, in the shallow water of his exhibit where he had retreated as his body finally failed him.
The staff who discovered him in the morning followed the established protocols, removing his body before visitors arrived, notifying the relevant departments, beginning the documentation that attended any significant event.
There was no ceremony. There was no announcement.
He was simply gone, his absence noted in internal records but not communicated to the public who came to the park expecting entertainment rather than reminders of mortality.
The other seals in the exhibit adjusted to his absence with the resilience their species had developed over millennia.
They filled the spaces he had occupied. They continued their routines.
They gave no outward sign that anything had changed. But the whale knew. The whale spent days at the eastern glass, waiting for someone who would never return. She refused to participate in shows, ignoring signals that had once triggered automatic responses. She ate less, moved less, spent hours floating in positions that worried the veterinary staff enough to schedule additional examinations. The trainers tried to redirect her attention, offering enrichment activities that had worked in the past, varying her routine to provide stimulation.
Nothing reached her.
She remained at the glass, watching the empty ledge, waiting with a patience that seemed to extend beyond any reasonable expectation of return.
The child who had asked if they were sad had grown into a teenager by now, her question forgotten in the accumulation of experiences that constitute growing up.
She had not returned to the park since that summer visit with her grandmother, who had died the following year. She did not know that the two animals she had observed for a few minutes on a Saturday afternoon had continued their silent vigil for years after she walked away. She did not know that her question, "Are they sad because they can't touch?" had captured something essential about captivity that researchers were only beginning to articulate, that activists were fighting to address, that institutions like this park were slowly being forced to confront. She was living her own life, facing her own challenges, forming her own connections that would eventually teach her what the whale and the seal had known instinctively. That love, if that word could be applied to whatever passed between those two creatures, did not require physical contact to be real.
The weeks after the seal's death became a kind of extended vigil,
Witnessed by visitors who did not understand what they were seeing. The whale continued to return to the eastern glass, continued to watch the empty space where her companion had once rested.
The staff discussed her behavior in meetings,
Consulted with veterinarians and behavioral specialists, debated whether intervention was needed or whether she should be allowed to process her loss if loss was even the right word in her own time. Some argued that anthropomorphizing her response was a mistake, that applying human concepts of grief to an animal was scientifically unsound. Others pointed to the research on cetacean intelligence, on the complex social structures of her species, on documented cases of mourning behavior in whales who had lost companions. No consensus was reached. No intervention was implemented. The whale was simply watched more closely, her behavior documented in increasingly detailed reports that would eventually contribute to broader discussions about the emotional lives of captive marine mammals.
spring arrived with its usual indifference to the concerns of creatures who lived within walls.
The park prepared for another season.
Another cycle of visitors who would come seeking the entertainment that had been promised in advertising campaigns and promotional materials.
New animals were introduced to various exhibits. Facilities were upgraded. Staff were trained and retrained and reminded of the importance of guest experience and safety protocols. The whale remained in her tank, the routine now permanently altered by the loss of the companion she had watched through the glass for years. She participated in shows again, eventually, her training reasserting itself after weeks of refusal. But something in her performance had changed. The trainers noticed it. The more attentive visitors noticed it. She was present, but not fully present, executing behaviors without the engagement that had once characterized her participation. A young trainer who had joined the staff that spring became curious about the whale's history. Having heard older colleagues mention a seal she had seemed attached to, he requested access to the archived observations, the documented notes that stretched back through decades of the park's operation. What he found surprised him: not a single dramatic incident, but a pattern of small behaviors that, viewed together, told a story of connection that had developed slowly over years. He found references to her positioning near the eastern glass, documented with increasing frequency, as the seal's presence on the ledge became a daily occurrence. He found notes about visitors who had noticed the behavior and asked questions that staff had not known how to answer. He found, buried in a quarterly report from years earlier, a paragraph speculating that the two animals might have formed some kind of bond. Though the report's author had been careful to qualify this observation with appropriate scientific caution, the trainer began spending more time near the eastern glass, observing the whale during the quiet hours when the park was closed to visitors. He saw what the documentation had described but could not fully capture: the way she positioned herself at the glass, the way she watched the empty ledge with what could only be described as patience, the way she sometimes made soft vocalizations that seemed directed toward the space where her companion had once rested. He began to understand that what he was witnessing was not a temporary response to loss but a permanent alteration in her behavior, a reorientation of her attention toward an absence that had become as powerful as any presence. He wrote about his observations in a journal he kept privately, knowing that formal reports required a kind of objectivity that felt inadequate to what he was seeing. The whale's final years were characterized by this divided attention: participation in the routines that continued to define her daily life, and retreat to the eastern glass where something still pulled her despite the emptiness on the other side. She grew older. Her movements grew slower. The shows that featured her became increasingly abbreviated as her capabilities declined. But she never stopped returning to the glass. She never stopped watching the ledge. Visitors who happened to pass through the corridor during these moments sometimes stopped and watched her watching, sensing that they were witnessing something significant, even if they could not articulate what it was. Some took photographs, some mentioned it to staff, asking questions that received unsatisfactory answers. Most simply moved on, their memories of the moment fading into the general blur of their park experience. The glass itself seemed to hold the memory of what had happened there. It was cleaned regularly, maintained according to the standards that governed all viewing surfaces in the park. But the trainers who passed through the corridor reported a particular quality to that section of glass, a sense that it had witnessed something that left a mark invisible to the eye but present nonetheless. This was not scientific, not documentable, not the kind of observation that could be included in official reports, but it was felt,
Shared among staff who had been at the park long enough to have seen the whale and the seal in their years of companionship.
They spoke of it quietly, in break rooms, in parking lots, in the spaces where institutional authority relaxed and personal experience was permitted to surface. The whale died on a morning in early autumn, when the first hints of seasonal change were visible in the quality of light and the temperature of air above her tank. She had been declining for months, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of decades lived in conditions her species had not evolved to endure.
The veterinary staff had been preparing for this eventuality,
implementing comfort measures and monitoring her condition with increasing frequency.
When the end came, it was not dramatic.
It was simply a cessation, a stopping, a transition from presence to absence that happened without fanfare or audience. The park was not yet open. The bleachers were empty. The only witnesses were the staff who had cared for her, who stood in the morning, quiet, and acknowledged that something significant had concluded. The protocols for handling such events were well established, having been refined through previous losses that had taught the institution how to manage both the practical and the public relations aspects of animal death. Her body was removed before visitors arrived. Statements were prepared for media outlets that would inevitably inquire. Social media posts were drafted and approved and scheduled for release. The main stadium was closed for the day, officially for maintenance. Actually, to allow staff time to process and to prevent visitors from asking questions that had no comfortable answers. By the next morning, the park was operating normally again. The gap in its collection already being addressed through the acquisition of younger animals who would eventually take her place in the shows and the promotional materials and the memories of visitors who would never know she had existed. But the glass remained. The eastern glass, where she had pressed herself for years, watching the ledge where her companion had rested, remained exactly where it had always been. The seal exhibit continued to operate, populated now by animals who had no connection to the one who had died years before. The corridor continued to channel visitors from one attraction to another, most of them hurrying through without stopping, none of them knowing that this space had been the site of something that exceeded the capacity of words to describe. The young trainer who had documented her behavior in his private journal stood in the corridor one evening after the park had closed, looking at the glass that held no visible evidence of the history he knew it carried. He thought about what he had witnessed. He thought about what it meant.
And he understood with a clarity that surprised him.
That some stories exist, not to be told but simply to be remembered by those who happen to be present while they unfolded.
The gaze she had directed at that glass, at the seal beyond it, at the empty ledge after his death, at something she could not have named and we cannot presume to understand, was never forgotten by those who saw it.
It lived
On in the memory of the elderly woman who found peace watching two creatures watch each other.
It lived on in the question of the child who asked whether they were sad because they could not touch. It lived on in the documentation of staff who struggled to describe what they observed within the constraints of institutional language. It lived on in the silence of the corridor after the park closed, when the glass reflected only emptiness and the water moved with no one watching. She had stayed close to that glass beside a seal whose presence meant something to her that we will never fully comprehend.
And her gaze patient, devoted.
Persisting even after its object had vanished became a kind of monument to connection that transcended the barriers designed to contain it. The park continued.
The seasons continued.
The visitors continued to come, seeking the entertainment and education that the institution promised to provide. New stories began in the tanks and exhibits, stories that would eventually end as hers had ended, as all stories end. But somewhere in the accumulated memory of the place, preserved in the recollections of those who had been present and in the documentation that would survive longer than any individual memory, the story of the whale and the seal endured. Not as legend, not as myth, but as simple fact. Two creatures, separated by glass, watched each other for years with an attention that resembled nothing so much as love. And when one of them was gone, the other kept watching, kept returning to the glass, kept directing her gaze toward an absence that had become the most important presence in her world. This is what remained. This is what was never forgotten. Not the shows she performed, not the tricks she executed, not the applause she received from crowds who came expecting spectacle. What remained was the image of a whale beside a glass, looking at a seal who looked back at her.
And later looking at the empty space where that seal had been.
What remained was the knowledge that captivity could not prevent connection, that walls and water and the vast differences between species could not stop two creatures from finding each other across the boundaries designed to keep them apart. What remained was her gaze, and the gaze of the seal, and the gazes of the humans who witnessed them, all of these gazes meeting and holding and carrying forward something that words could only approximate but never fully capture. She stayed close to the glass, She watched, and she was not forgotten.